There is a place in the red clay soil of southwest Georgia where the ground itself seems to remember something terrible, where the earth is soft in ways it shouldn't be, where the air, even on the hottest August afternoon, carries a weight that has nothing to do with humidity. Locals have known about it for generations. They don't linger there. They don't let their children run through the grass the way children normally do in open fields. They just know, the way communities that live near tragedy always know, that what happened here was not ordinary suffering. It was something that bends the definition of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. Andersonville. Even the name sounds like a place someone invented, like a town from a novel where bad things happen for the sake of plot. But it was real. The men who died there were real. The man who ran it was real. And the final months of its operation, the period that most textbooks either gloss over in 2 sentences or skip entirely, were so far beyond what most people understand about Civil War history that once you know the full picture, you cannot unknow it. This is the story of what happened at Andersonville Prison when the Confederacy began to collapse, when the guards started disappearing, when food stopped arriving, when men who had already been surviving on almost nothing were pushed into a category of suffering that doesn't have a clean historical name, when the dying accelerated rather than slowed, when freedom was theoretically within reach, but the bodies kept piling up anyway. And when the man responsible for all of it stood before a military tribunal and argued, with a straight face, that none of it was his fault. Most people who know the name Andersonville know the basics: a Confederate prisoner of war camp, overcrowded, men died by the thousands, there was a trial afterward. But that summary, as accurate as it technically is the equivalent of saying the Titanic was a boat that sank. It is true in the narrowest possible sense, and entirely inadequate in every way that actually matters. Camp Sumter, that was the official name, though almost nobody used it, was established in early 1864 in Sumter County, Georgia. The Confederate military chose the location for reasons that made sense on paper. It was deep in the interior of the South, far from any plausible Union rescue operation. It was connected to a railroad line, which meant supplies could theoretically be moved in and prisoners could be moved in from the overwhelmed camps in Virginia. It was surrounded by farmland, which meant food should have been available. It was, in other words, chosen with the assumption that someone was actually going to run it properly. That assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The original plan called for the camp to hold 10,000 prisoners. By the summer of 1864, it held more than 32,000. Let that number sit for a moment. 32,000 men crammed into roughly 26 acres of land, most of it a low-lying floodplain that turned into a swamp every time it rained. There were no barracks. The men lived in whatever shelter they could construct from whatever materials they could scavenge. Most of them lived in holes they dug into the ground with their hands, or with spoons, or with whatever piece of tin or scrap wood they managed to find. These were called shebangs. Some were elaborate. Most were barely more than a depression in the earth, covered with a rotting blanket. In the Georgia summer, with temperatures regularly pushing past 90 degrees, men lay in these holes and baked. In the rare cold snaps of winter, they froze. The ground was always wet. The air was always thick. The smell, according to every single account written by survivors, was beyond description. Not just unpleasant, not just offensive, the kind of smell that enters you and stays, that survivors wrote about decades later as the first thing that returned to them in nightmares.
The water situation was what turned bad conditions into something lethal. A single creek ran through the camp called Stockade Branch. That creek was the prisoners' only source of water. It was also where the prisoners bathed, where they urinated and defecated, where the cooking water came from, and where the overflow from the hospital tents drained. Within weeks of the camp opening, the creek was a slow-moving river of sewage. Men with dysentery drank from it because there was nothing else. Then more men got dysentery. Then the creek got worse. Then more men died. It was a feedback loop of contamination that anyone with a basic understanding of sanitation could have prevented, and that nobody in the Confederate command structure bothered to address. Henry Wirz arrived as commandant in late March of 1864. He was Swiss-born, had a permanent injury to his right arm from a wound at the Battle of Seven Pines, and had a personality that is genuinely difficult to characterize fairly because everything we know about him comes either from people who wanted to hang him or from his own self-serving testimony. What we can say with confidence is that he was short-tempered, that he communicated in heavily accented English that prisoners often found difficult to understand, and that he ran the camp's interior operations with a combination of rigid bureaucratic procedure and explosive personal cruelty that left an impression on every man who survived long enough to leave. He was not, by any honest measure, the primary architect of the disaster. The disaster was the result of policy decisions made far above his rank. The Confederate decision to stop exchanging prisoners, made in large part because the Union started enlisting black soldiers, and the Confederacy refused to treat black Union prisoners as legitimate combatants and exchange them equally, is what caused the massive overcrowding. The failure to build barracks, to provide adequate food rations, to establish clean water infrastructure, to staff the medical operation properly, all of those were failures of the Confederate High Command and of the Confederate war economy more broadly. Wirz operated within a system designed to fail. But here is the thing about operating within a system designed to fail. You still have choices. You still make decisions every single day. And the decisions Wirz made, the specific texture of his cruelty, the personal delight he seemed to take in the suffering of men under his authority, those things are documented in enough independent accounts that dismissing them as Union propaganda becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Men described him riding his horse through the prison compound and striking prisoners with his sword. They described him ordering men into the stocks for minor infractions, men who were already too sick to stand. They described him threatening to withhold food rations as punishment for collective behavior. Whatever systemic forces created the conditions at Andersonville, Wirz made those conditions worse through his own individual choices every single day. The Raiders arrived in that context, because when you pack 30,000 men into a space without adequate food, without law, without real authority that cares whether they live or die, you do not get 30,000 men cooperating peacefully. You get what humans have always produced under extreme scarcity: hierarchy, violence, and predation. The Raiders were a gang, mostly composed of men from New York and a few other northern cities who had organized themselves into a criminal operation inside the Stockade. They stole food, they stole clothing, which at Andersonville was not a comfort item, but a survival item, since men died of exposure. They beat men who resisted. They beat men who didn't resist. They murdered at least 6 men whose deaths are documented, and probably significantly more whose deaths were attributed to illness or exposure rather than violence. Their leader, a man named William Collins, who went by the nickname Mosby, ran the operation with the kind of casual brutality that suggests he had done this before.
The Regulators were the response, a group of prisoners who decided at a certain point that the Raiders had to be stopped, and that waiting for Confederate authorities to care about the internal violence of a Union prison camp was not a viable strategy. The Regulators organized, fought the Raiders in what survivors described as a genuine battle that lasted several hours, captured the Raider leadership, and then did something remarkable. They asked Wirz for permission to try them. Wirz agreed. A formal court was convened inside the stockade. Evidence was presented. Sentences were handed down. 6 men were condemned to death, and on July 11, 1864, those 6 men were hanged inside the prison compound by their fellow prisoners, using a gallows that other prisoners built. The graves of those 6 Raiders are still at Andersonville today. They are buried apart from the other prisoners, separated by distance and by the particular disgrace of being men who, even in conditions of profound shared suffering, chose to prey on the weakest among them. By the summer of 1864, Andersonville was killing men faster than anywhere else in the Civil War. Not in battle, not from combat wounds, from scurvy, from dysentery, from gangrene, from something the prisoners called hospital fever that was probably typhoid, from a condition they called the scurvy rot, where a man's teeth fell out and his gums turned black and his skin developed open sores that spread without stopping. At the peak of the overcrowding, roughly 100 men died every single day. In August of 1864 alone, nearly 3,000 men died. 3,000 in 1 month at a single prison camp. That number exceeds the American military deaths at the Battle of Gettysburg on its bloodiest day. The hospital was a term being used extremely loosely. It was a collection of tents and open-air lean-tos set up outside the main stockade wall, staffed by Confederate surgeons who themselves often sick, operating with almost no medicine, almost no bandages, almost no surgical equipment, and almost no food to give recovering patients. Men who were sent to the hospital frequently died faster than men who stayed in the stockade because the journey to the hospital itself was exhausting to men who had no reserves left, and because the care available was not meaningfully better than no care at all. Survivors wrote about seeing men lying in the hospital who had been dead for hours before anyone noticed, because the living men around them looked almost the same.
The hospital itself was exhausting to men who had no reserves left, and because the care available was not meaningfully better than no care at all. Survivors wrote about seeing men lying in the hospital who had been dead for hours before anyone noticed, because the living men around them looked almost the same. The Providence Spring is part of the Andersonville story that carries a quality that is almost too symbolic to be believed, which is probably why it appears in so many accounts. In August of 1864, after a heavy rainstorm, a spring broke through the ground inside the stockade walls. Clean water, fresh water, water that came from somewhere deep enough underground that it had not been contaminated by the hellscape of the camp. Men who witnessed it described it in terms that were explicitly religious. They called it a miracle. Some wept. Andersonville was a place that had destroyed so many men's faith in God and in humanity, and in the basic premise that the world operated according to any principles of justice. And then a spring of clean water appeared in the ground as if summoned, and the men who were well enough to move surged toward it. The spring still flows today. There's a small structure built over it by veterans after the war. People visit it. Some of them cry, which seems like the appropriate response. What happened in the final months of Andersonville's operation is where the story moves into territory that history books reliably treat as a footnote when they mention it at all. Because what happened in the final months was, in some ways, more terrible than what had come before. Not because the conditions were worse, though in certain specific respects they were, but because of the particular cruelty of proximity to rescue, of being close enough to the end that you could theoretically sense it and dying anyway, of the war winding down in ways that everyone could see and the dying at Andersonville failing to stop. Sherman's march to the sea began in November of 1864. Sherman cut his supply lines, turned his army loose on the civilian and industrial infrastructure of Georgia, and marched from Atlanta to Savannah in a campaign that effectively split the Confederacy in two and demonstrated in a way that even Confederate civilians could no longer deny that the war was lost. Sherman's army moved through Georgia like a wave, and as it moved, the Confederate military scrambled to decide what to do with the tens of thousands of Union prisoners sitting in camps across the Deep South. The decision they made was to move them, which sounds on the surface like a reasonable military response to the threat of enemy forces liberating your prisoners. But the men at Andersonville had been there for months. Most of them were not ambulatory in any meaningful sense. They were men whose bodies had been reduced to their minimum viable functions. Moving them meant loading them onto railroad cars in whatever condition they were in, transporting them to other camps that were not equipped to receive them, and beginning the whole process of inadequate shelter and inadequate food in a new location. For thousands of men, the transfer itself was fatal. Beginning in September of 1864, large groups of Andersonville prisoners were transferred to South Carolina and North Carolina and other Confederate states. The transfers were chaotic, poorly organized, and deadly. Men who survived Andersonville through luck and stubbornness and whatever private reserves of will they had managed to maintain died during the transfers from exposure, from the shock of movement on bodies that had adapted to stillness, from diseases that the transfer conditions accelerated. The Confederate command had decided that the solution to one humanitarian catastrophe was to distribute it across multiple locations, and in the process of distributing it, they killed additional thousands of men. The men who remained at Andersonville after the transfers were often, in a paradoxical way, the worst off. They had been left behind either because they were too sick to move or because the logistics of the transfers ran out before they were reached. The camp population dropped dramatically, which created additional problems because the Confederate infrastructure, if it was, had been calibrated for a much larger population. Guards who had been detailed to Andersonville were reassigned. Supply deliveries, already irregular, became more irregular. The camp was operating in its final months with a skeleton crew of Confederate personnel who were themselves frightened, poorly fed, and increasingly aware that they were on the losing side of the war.
The testimony of the guards who were at Andersonville in its final period is rarely included in popular histories of the camp. It is included in the trial records, which are voluminous and mostly unread. What those testimonies reveal is a picture of institutional collapse that is almost as striking as the suffering it produced. Guards described not knowing when their own rations would arrive, described receiving orders from superior officers who had already quietly abandoned their posts, described watching the Confederate chain of command dissolve in real time, each level waiting for direction from the level above it having already determined that self-preservation was the operative priority. The prisoners, meanwhile, existed in a kind of terrible informational vacuum. They knew the war was going badly for the Confederacy. News filtered in through guards, through new arrivals, through the distant sound of artillery that occasionally reached the camp. They knew Sherman had taken Atlanta. They knew something called the March to the Sea was happening. They did not know where Sherman's army was at any given moment. They did not know when or whether rescue was coming. And in that uncertainty, in that condition of knowing that rescue was theoretically possible while having no way to know if it was actually imminent, men made decisions that sometimes saved their lives and sometimes killed them. Some men attempted escapes. The tunnel attempts at Andersonville are documented but less famous than the Great Escape of World War II, partly because they were less successful and partly because the conditions of Andersonville made tunnel construction almost comically difficult.
The ground near the stockade walls was constantly monitored by Confederate sentinels. Men who were caught trying to escape were subjected to punishment ranging from the stocks to being shot on sight. The dead line, a small wooden railing set approximately 19 feet inside the stockade walls, past which any prisoner who crossed would be shot immediately without warning, was one of the specific charges against Wirz at his trial. Multiple prisoners testified that men were shot at the deadline for reasons that had nothing to do with escape attempts. A man reaching for a ball that rolled past it, a man who stumbled in his weakened condition. Men shot because a guard decided they were close enough to the line that shooting could be justified after the fact. The specific horror of the deadline is that it created a psychological trap on top of a physical one. Men who were delirious with fever sometimes crossed it without knowing where they were. Men who had given up on surviving sometimes crossed it deliberately. Men who were simply trying to move through a catastrophically overcrowded space in conditions of near total darkness at night sometimes crossed it by accident, and the response was always the same: a rifle shot, a body that lay where it fell until the morning detail came to collect it. As 1864 became 1865, the war entered its terminal phase. The Union was winning, visibly, irreversibly, in ways that even the most committed Confederate supporters could not honestly deny. Lee's army was pinned at Petersburg. Sherman was moving north through the Carolinas. The Confederate government was beginning to make contingency plans that amounted to planning for the end of the Confederate government, and Andersonville continued to operate. This is the part that requires sitting with. Andersonville did not close when the Confederate cause became clearly lost. It did not close when Sherman's march demonstrated that Georgia itself was no longer a secure Confederate territory. It continued to operate, continued to receive prisoners in some cases, continued to produce deaths at a rate that had been slowing from its catastrophic summer peak, but remained grotesque by any conceivable humanitarian standard. Men were still dying at Andersonville in 1865 from conditions that were the direct result of decisions made by human beings who had the option of making different decisions. By the time the war ended in April of 1865, more than 12,700 Union soldiers had died at Andersonville. That number is the official count, derived from the meticulous death records that, in one of history's grimmer ironies, the Confederates kept quite carefully, even while failing to maintain basic standards of food and water and shelter. The actual number was almost certainly higher, because the record-keeping was only careful up to a point, and because some deaths were categorized in ways that obscured their true cause. But 12,700 is the number that gets put in books, and 12,700 is enough. The graves were dug by other prisoners because the Confederates at Andersonville were not going to do that labor themselves. A man named Dorrance Atwater kept a private copy of the death register, understanding that the official records would likely be lost, destroyed, or hidden after the war. He smuggled the list out when he was released, preserved it, and eventually provided it to the U.S. government. Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, a fact that suddenly makes complete sense when you understand what she was responding to, went to Andersonville in the summer of 1865 with a team of workers and used Atwater's list to identify and mark the graves properly. Because of them, nearly all of the graves at what is now the Andersonville National Cemetery have names on them. That is not typical. That is not what happened at most mass grave sites from this period. It happened at Andersonville because specific individuals made it their mission to make sure those men were anonymous in death, even if they had been dehumanized in life.